I cannot take this anymore.
Victor, please.
Victor, please.
Think about our baby.
It is over. I am done.
Before the story begins, I need you to see one image clearly. A woman, 31 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in the lobby of a large corporate building on a Tuesday morning, holding a folder against her chest the way you hold something you have spent years building. She is wearing a deep green blouse. Her hair is neat, her shoes are clean. She has done everything right. She prepared for this the way her mother taught her to prepare for things that matter, with care, with intention, with the quiet dignity of someone who understands that how you present yourself when asking for something is a form of respect, both for the person you are asking and for yourself. She joined the queue. She waited. She was not there long before a man approached her. He was not security. He was not a junior staff member responding to a policy. He was the head of human resources. He had a title. He had an office on the 7th floor. He had 11 years of institutional authority moving behind him like a shadow. He looked at her stomach. Then he took the folder from her hands. She did not offer it. He simply reached out and took it. And then, in front of every person in that lobby, in front of the security desk and the receptionist and the other applicants and the cleaner moving a mop across the floor near the door, he tore it. Once across the middle, then again, until the certificates and the recommendation letters and the CV that represented 4 years of professional accomplishment were in pieces on the polished floor. He dropped the remains at her feet. He said something. She did not respond. She bent down carefully, given the weight she was carrying, picked up one half-torn page, placed it in her bag, and straightened up and walked to the door. Her back was straight. She did not cry until she reached her car, and what she did inside that car before she made the phone call that would change every life in this story is the part nobody has told yet. Stay with me, because the man who tore that folder had no idea whose wife he had just humiliated. And before the week was finished, he would understand what it means when the person you have treated as invisible turns out to be the most visible person in the room. If this kind of story is why you are here, like this video right now and subscribe. Share it with someone who has ever been dismissed before they were given the chance to speak. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see where this travels. And stay with me, because the moment Tina made that phone call from the parking lot is the moment this story truly begins. There are people who use authority the way a skilled craftsman uses tools, carefully, precisely, in service of something larger than the moment of its use. And there are people who use authority the way someone uses a sharp object they have found and cannot put down. Not because they need it, but because they have discovered that it produces a reaction and the reaction has become the point. Victor Adeyemi was the second kind. He had been the head of human resources at Prestige Meridian Industries for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 4 years as a senior HR officer at 2 smaller firms where his efficiency had been recognized and rewarded, and his cruelty had not yet found the scale it needed to fully express itself. Those environments were not small. Accountability was too close. Someone would eventually have noticed. Prestige Meridian was not small. 14 floors, over 800 employees, a managing director who sat on 3 other boards and attended most of his own meetings via teleconference from Abuja. The kind of organizational distance between the top and the bottom that allows certain behaviors to persist for years because nobody with authority to stop them ever gets close enough to see them clearly. Victor had understood this structure intuitively from his first month. He had made himself essential in the ways that were visible and had protected himself in the ways that were not. He processed payroll on time, He filed compliance reports accurately. He attended every meeting he was required to attend and several he was not, because he understood that presence in rooms was a form of influence, and influence was what he was actually there to accumulate. What he did with that influence was a different conversation. There was a woman named Adaobi who had applied for a communications role and had made it to the final interview stage before Victor had pulled her aside in the corridor and told her that her presentation style was not aligned with the company's brand. Not her qualifications, not her portfolio, her presentation style. It had taken Adaobi 3 days to understand that what he was actually saying had nothing to do with presentation. She had written in a journal that night that she felt like something had been taken from her in that corridor and she did not know how to ask for it back. There was a man named Rashid who had worked in the procurement department for 7 years and had documented performance reviews that placed him consistently in the top 20% of his department. When an internal promotion became available, Rashid had applied through the proper channels and received no response for 6 weeks. When he had finally managed to speak to Victor's assistant, he had been told the position had been filled. It had not been filled. It had been quietly removed so that someone Victor preferred could be brought in from outside. Rashid had found this out from a colleague 8 months later and had never reported it because he had calculated that the cost of reporting it was higher than the cost of absorbing it. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern. And patterns at that scale persist not because nobody notices, but because the people who notice have also noticed that the cost of saying something is borne entirely by the person who speaks rather than the person who should be listening. New employees at Prestige Meridian were always briefed within their first 2 weeks by someone who had been there long enough to understand the landscape. The briefing was never formal. It happened in canteens and corridors and in the kind of lowered voices that people use when they are sharing information they want to be heard but not attributed. The content was always the same. Stay invisible to Victor Adeyemi. If he notices you, make yourself as agreeable as possible. Never give him a reason to focus. And if he focuses on you despite your best efforts, begin preparing for the possibility that your time here is limited regardless of what you have done or not done. Victor had heard versions of this kind of story about other people in other organizations, people who had eventually been held accountable for behavior that resembled his. He had read about them the way people read cautionary tales, with the comfortable certainty that the story was about someone else, that the person had made mistakes he would not have made, that there was always a way to manage the outcome if you were sufficiently strategic. He had never once sat with the possibility that the story could be his own. This was partly arrogance, partly the specific blindness that settles over people who have been operating without consequence for long enough that consequence begins to feel theoretical rather than actual. And partly because he had never yet met the person whose presence in his lobby would end his career, until the Tuesday morning that Tina walked in. Before we go further, I need you to tell you something about Victor that the rest of this story will not tell you. There was a time when he was different. Not dramatically different, not a different person entirely, but different in the specific way that people are different before certain things happen to them and before they make certain choices in response to those things. His mother, a woman named Mama Adeyemi, had raised him alone in Ibadan from the time he was 9 years old, after his father had relocated to another city with another family and had maintained contact with the declining frequency of someone who has decided that a previous life was a previous self. Mama Adeyemi had told Victor 2 things repeatedly throughout his childhood. The first was that how you treat people who cannot do anything for you is who you actually are. The second was that every human being who stands in front of you is carrying something you cannot see. Treat them accordingly. Victor had heard both of these things many times. He had absorbed them the way children absorb things they hear regularly, not necessarily believing them, not necessarily disbelieving them, simply storing them in the part of the mind that holds the things our parents said before we decided we knew better. Somewhere between his first job and his 5th promotion, something had shifted. Not suddenly, slowly, the way erosion works, one choice at a time, one small accommodation of cruelty that produced a result he wanted, then another, then another, until the choices had accumulated into a character that would have been unrecognizable to the boy his mother had raised and entirely familiar to everyone who worked at Prestige Meridian. He had become the person his mother had warned him about. He had simply not noticed because becoming that person had felt like, from the inside, becoming successful. Tina was 31 years old. She had grown up in Onitsha, the second of 4 children, in a house where the standards were not negotiable and the expectations were not conditional. Her father was a retired engineer. Her mother ran a successful wholesale fabric business from their compound for 18 years, which meant that by the time she was 14, she understood what it meant to build something from consistent effort and protect it from the specific erosion that came from cutting corners on quality or character. She had studied supply chain management at university and graduated at the top of her department. She had completed a master's degree in operations management in Lagos and had spent the subsequent 4 years managing vendor relationships and distribution networks for a mid-tier logistics firm, where she had earned a reputation for the specific quality of being someone whose word meant something. If Tina said a shipment would arrive on time, it arrived on time. If she said a vendor was reliable, the vendor was reliable. She did not promise things she could not deliver, and she did not deliver less than she had promised. She was also, as of 8 months ago, pregnant with her first child. This pregnancy had been a long time coming. She and her husband had spent 3 years navigating the specific hope and disappointment cycle that fertility challenges produce and that very few people discuss honestly, because the pain of it sits in a place that is too private for most conversations. When the confirmation finally came, she had been in the hospital bathroom. She had looked at the result for a long time before she could move. Then she had walked out and found her husband in the corridor and shown him without saying anything, and watched his face do something she had not seen it do before and had not been able to describe afterward, even when she tried. Her husband was Senator Emeka Obiora. He represented his constituency in Anambra State and had done so for 2 terms. He chaired the Senate Committee on Trade and Investment. He was the kind of man whose name moved through certain conversations before he arrived in them, not because he pursued visibility, but because the decisions he was involved in produced consequences that became visible whether he wanted them to or not. He was also, as of the account of everyone who knew him outside of official contexts, simply Emeka, a man who had grown up without the things that now surrounded him, who had not forgotten what it felt like to be without them, and who had decided early in his adult life that the test of who he actually was will be found not in what he did with power when the cameras were present, but in what he did with it when they were not. One evening, 3 months into Tina's pregnancy, lying in their bedroom after dinner with the specific ease of people who have been together long enough that silence is not uncomfortable, Tina had turned to him and said she wanted to go back to work. He had looked at her, not with surprise, with attention. She told him she wanted to apply for positions in her field, on her own terms, without his name, without the protection that being his wife would provide, and that she did not want because the job she got with that protection would always belong to the protection rather than to her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand. And I am proud of you for knowing exactly what you want and why." She smiled. He had added, "But I need one thing from you. If anyone, at any point, disrespects you because of your pregnancy or for any other reason, you call me before you do anything else. Not after, before. Do you hear me?" She agreed. She had not expected to need the agreement. The lobby of Prestige Meridian Industries at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning was the ordinary lobby of a large company conducting ordinary business. About 16 applicants were present at various stages of the intake process. The receptionist was managing documents with practiced efficiency. Security was at the door. The cleaner was working near the entrance. Tina joined the queue. She stood with her folder held against her chest and her hand resting on her stomach and her mind moving through the specific checklist of someone who has prepared carefully and is now running through the preparation one final time. She knew the company's recent procurement challenges. She had reviewed their logistic structure using publicly available information. She had prepared specific answers to specific questions she expected to be asked. She was ready. Victor came through the lobby at 9:22. He was not required to be in the lobby during intake. Managing initial applications was the receptionist function. But Victor made a habit of moving through during intake windows because he decided years ago that first impression was a form of information and that gathering it before the formal process began gave him something he considered an advantage. He saw Tina. He registered her stomach. And before any other piece of information had been gathered or processed, a decision formed behind his eyes. He walked toward her. "Excuse me," he said. She turned. Her expression was composed. "Good morning, sir. What is the purpose of your visit today?" "I'm here for the interview. Supply chain analyst position. I have my full documentation." Victor looked at her stomach, then at her folder, then back at her face. His expression carried the specific quality of a person who has decided to perform something for the room. "Do you know what kind of company this is?" He raised his voice slightly, not dramatically, just enough that the people nearest them would hear without having to try. "Yes, sir. Prestige Meridian Industries. I have followed the company for prestige," he said, interrupting her with the word itself as though it were a verdict. "This is a prestige organization. We have built this brand over 20 years. We do not run a community health center." He gestured at her stomach with an expression of open dismissal. "What exactly is your plan here? We interview you today and in 3 weeks you are on maternity leave? That is what you are offering us?" The lobby had quieted. The receptionist had found something on her desk that required her full attention. The applicants near Tina had developed a shared interest in their phones. Tina kept her voice even. "Sir, my qualifications are relevant and current. I am committed to this role and I am prepared to demonstrate that through the interview process. I would ask that my application be evaluated on its merits." Something in her composure aggravated him. He had expected the beginning of a break, and she had not broken. He reached out and took the folder from her hands. She had not offered it. He simply took it. He held it at both ends. The lobby went completely silent. He tore it across the middle. The sound of it was specific and sharp in the quiet room. Then again, until the certificate and the reference letters and the CV were in fragments, and he let them fall from his hands to the floor around her like he was disposing of something that had never mattered. He looked at her. "Your documents," he said with a smile that had nothing warm in it, "have assessed themselves. Go home. Come back after you have had your child and found a babysitter and remembered what professional means. This building is not the place for what you are currently offering." 3 people in the lobby were recording. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward her. Tina looked at the pieces of her folder on the floor. She looked at Victor. She looked at the floor again. Then she bent down carefully and picked up 1 half-torn page. She placed it in her bag. She stood. She looked at Victor one last time with an expression that he would think about later, in the weeks after the conference room, when he had time to think about things he had previously been too busy being powerful to examine. It was not an expression of anger. It was not an expression of pain. It was something quieter and more difficult to name. The expression of someone who has just learned something specific about the world and has filed it away for later. She turned. She walked to the door. Her back was straight. The lobby door closed behind her. Victor dusted his palms together, looked at the remaining applicants, and said, "Next." The parking lot of Prestige Meridian Industries was a large open space that held perhaps 300 cars on a full day. At 9:30 in the morning, it was about half full. Tina's car was parked in the 3rd row from the entrance. She walked to it without hurrying. She got in. She closed the door. She sat for a long time without doing anything. This is the part of the story that nobody witnessed. There were no cameras in the parking lot. There were no other people near her car. What happened in those minutes between closing the door and making the phone call belonged entirely to her. What she did first was breathe. Not the controlled breathing of someone managing a situation. The breathing of someone whose body has been holding something at considerable cost and has been given permission to release it now that she is alone. She breathed for about 2 minutes. The kind of breathing that is very close to crying, but has not decided whether to cross that line. Then she looked at the half-torn page she had put in her bag. It was half a recommendation letter written by her former managing director. It said, in the portion that remained legible, that Tina had consistently demonstrated the kind of professional judgment that made her not just a reliable member of the team, but someone who elevated the quality of decisions made around her. She had used this letter in applications before, and it had always produced responses. Today, it was in 2 pieces on the floor of a corporate lobby. She held the half page. Then she put it on the passenger seat. Then she cried. Not loudly, privately, the way people cry when they are alone and do not need to manage the impression their grief makes on anyone. She cried for about 4 minutes, not because she was defeated. She was not defeated. She cried because she was 8 months pregnant, and she had walked into a building in good faith with her best work carefully prepared, and a man had taken it from her hands and destroyed it in front of strangers, and nobody in the room had said a word. She cried because it had happened to her, but she understood, sitting in that parking lot, that it had happened to many people who did not have a phone call to make that would produce any consequence at all. She cried for them too, briefly, because she was the kind of person who could not receive a particular injustice without thinking about all the people receiving the same injustice with fewer resources. Then she picked up her phone. She called her husband. She did not perform composure on the call. She told him what had happened the way she actually experienced it. The lobby, the other applicants, the sound of the folder being torn, the floor, the half-torn page, the man's face as she walked out. Senator Biora listened without interrupting. He asked her one question when she finished. "Are you physically all right, you and the baby?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. His voice had changed in a way that she recognized, not louder, quieter, but with a quality beneath the quiet that she had heard before, and that she knew meant a decision had been made and was now simply awaiting execution. "I need you to go home, drink something, rest. I will handle this. You do not need to do anything else." She asked, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Something that should have been done a long time ago, not just for you, for every person who has walked into that building and walked out carrying what you are carrying right now." He paused. Then he said, "And Tina, I need you to know something. What that man did today has nothing to do with who you are or what your work is worth. Nothing. I need you to know I believe that, and I need you to believe it too." She said she did. She drove home. Now, let me tell you about the woman in the 3-bedroom flat in Lekki who had not been asked about her opinion on any of this. Her name was Ngozi. She was Victor Adeyemi's wife. She had been a secondary school biology teacher when they met. She had loved teaching with the specific love of someone who has found the thing they are suited for before they had to spend too long looking. She was good with the students who found the subject difficult. She had a quality of patience that was not passive, but active. She met confusion where it was and walked it toward understanding without making the student feel the distance they had traveled. Victor had asked her to stop working 2 years into their marriage. He had framed it as his preference, and then as a concern for the household, and finally as a condition. She had agreed because she had believed at that point that accommodation was a form of love and that his preferences were worth prioritizing because he carried the household financially, and financial contribution was a kind of authority she had not yet decided to question. She had not returned to teaching. The flat they lived in was comfortable by most standards. It had space, and the children were housed properly, and there was food, and the school fees were paid when they were paid, which was not always on time, and which required Ngozi to conduct a specific negotiation with Victor each term that she had learned to approach strategically rather than honestly, because honesty produced arguments, and arguments produced a version of Victor that lingered in the flat for days afterward like weather. She had 2 sons and a daughter, 12, 9, and 5. The 12-year-old, Damilola, had developed a specific skill over the past 3 years. He could read the sound of his father's key in the lock and determine within 2 seconds whether the evening was going to require him to disappear quietly to his room with his siblings or whether it was safe to be visible. He had taught this skill to his 9-year-old brother without being asked, because he understood that it was a protective knowledge and that protective knowledge should be shared. The 5-year-old daughter, Remy, had asked her mother 6 months ago why Daddy's voice was always so loud. Ngozi had told her that Daddy worked very hard, and sometimes people who worked very hard carried the tiredness home in their voice. Remy had considered this. Then she had said, "But you work hard too, Mommy, and your voice isn't loud." Ngozi had not had an answer for that. She had simply held her daughter and hoped that 5-year-olds forgot questions more easily than they actually did. The night before the conference room, Victor had come home at 10:45. Ngozi had kept his food warm. He had eaten in silence, which was a version of the evening she had learned to receive as relatively peaceful. He had not shouted. He had not found anything to criticize. He had watched television for an hour and gone to bed. Ngozi had sat in the kitchen after he was asleep and had thought, as she thought most nights when the flat was quiet, about the question of when, not if. She had moved past if a long time ago. The question was when. When she would have somewhere to go, when the children were old enough, when she had enough of whatever she needed to stop absorbing what she had been absorbing. She had not known that the answer to when was going to arrive from outside rather than from inside. She had not known that tomorrow had already been decided. The same night, in his flat, Victor was asleep by 11:30. He had had a routine Tuesday. He had processed 3 termination letters, attended a senior management meeting, and had a brief altercation with a supplier who called to dispute an invoice. He had won the dispute, as he usually won disputes, through a combination of institutional authority and the specific aggression he deployed when someone pushed back against him. He moved through the lobby incident with the woman at 9:30 the way he moved through most of his days, efficiently, without residue. He did not think about the torn folder. He did not think about her face as she walked to the door. He did not think about the half-torn page she had picked up from the floor and put in her bag. He slept well. In 12 hours, he would be sitting in a conference room with his employment terminating around him, and he would think about all of these things with great specificity, and the thinking would not help him at all, because the time of thinking had passed in the parking lot of his own company, when a woman he had dismissed as insignificant had made a call. The following morning, Senator Emeka Ogbiora made 3 calls before 7 a.m. The first was to his personal lawyer, Barrister Chioma Eze, a woman known in legal circles for the specific quality of her preparation. She did not go into rooms hoping for good outcomes. She went in having already produced the outcome she intended, and the hearing was simply the formal presentation of what had already been decided by the quality of her work. The second call was to Chief Adewale Fashola, who sat on the board of Prestige Meridian Industries and who owed the senator a professional debt that had not yet been called in. Chief Adewale received the call at 6:45 in the morning and by 6:50 had agreed to everything that was asked of him. The third call was to his assistant, with instructions that Tina was to be formally engaged as a special consultant by the board of Prestige Meridian Industries. Her role would be a confidential review of the company's HR practices and recruitment culture. She would have access to all staff, she would have access to all records, and she would report directly to the board. The senator had not designed this plan to simply remove Victor. He had designed it to expose what Victor had been able to do and why he had been able to do it for so long without consequence. Because he understood, from his own experience in governance, that removing a person without addressing the system that produced and protected them was not justice. It was replacement. And replacement without systemic change was simply rearranging which people the system was going to harm next. Tina returned to Prestige Meridian Industries 1 week later, not as an applicant, as a consultant appointed by the board. She was wearing a grey blouse and dark trousers. Her hair was tied back. She was carrying a notebook and a briefcase. She was 8 months pregnant, and she walked into the lobby of the building that humiliated her 7 days earlier with the calm deliberateness of someone who has been given a specific job and intends to do it properly. The receptionist recognized her immediately. The expression on her face moved through 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, confusion, and then the specific recalibration of someone who understands that the situation has changed significantly but has not received enough information to understand how. Victor was crossing the lobby. He saw her. He stopped mid-stride. For a moment, his face showed the unmanaged version of what he felt, which was something close to shock, dressed quickly in the clothes of contempt, because contempt was comfortable than the alternative. Tina did not look at him. She walked past him as though he were a feature of the lobby rather than a person in it. She greeted the receptionist. She presented her appointment letter. She was escorted to the executive floor. Victor stood in the lobby and watched her disappear into the elevator. Then he straightened his tie and told himself it was nothing. She was a contractor, a temporary presence. He had survived more significant challenges than a pregnant consultant with a board appointment. He was Victor Adeyemi. He had been running this department for 11 years. He went upstairs. He did not know that his elevation had just ended. For the following 2 weeks, Tina moved through the company the way water moves through a structure. Quietly, finding every gap, reaching every corner. She sat in meetings. She reviewed files. She requested access to recruitment records going back 5 years and received them without obstruction because her appointment letter came from the board and the board's authority was not available for Victor to redirect. She interviewed staff in small rooms with closed doors. She asked simple questions. How long have you been with the company? What do you enjoy about working here? Is there anything about the work environment that you find difficult? Has anyone ever made you feel unwelcome or less than you are in this organization? If you could change one thing about how people are treated here, what would it be? The first 3 interviews produced careful, measured responses. People who had learned to calibrate what they said in professional environments, who had learned that honesty was a cost to be weighed before it was offered. The 4th interview produced a story. A woman named Sade, who had worked in the accounts department for 4 years and who had come to the interview with the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had decided in the span of walking from her desk to this room that today was the day she was going to set it down. She told Tina out a morning 2 years ago when she had been passed over for a team lead position that she was the most experienced candidate for. She had gone to Victor's office to ask for feedback. He had told her the position required someone with a certain leadership presence. She had asked what that meant. He looked at her for a long moment and then said that certain people communicated competence more naturally than others, and that she might consider working on how she presented herself before she applied for leadership roles again. She had gone back to her desk and spent 3 months wondering what was wrong with the way she presented herself before she had finally asked a trusted colleague. And the colleague had told her quietly that the person who got the position had been a close friend of Victor's from outside the company. I spent 3 months thinking the problem was me, Sade told Tina. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. 3 months adjusting how I spoke and how I dressed and how I entered rooms because he made me feel like there was something fundamentally wrong with how I existed in professional spaces. She paused. There was nothing wrong with me. There was something wrong with him. But by the time I understood that, I had already done 3 months of damage to myself, trying to fix something that was never broken. Tina listened to every word. She wrote nothing while Sade was speaking. She waited until Sade was finished, and then she asked one question. Is there anything you would like me to do with what you have told me today? Sade looked at her. I want the people who should have known about this to know about it, she said. I want it to be on record somewhere that this happened, not just to me, to many people, and I want it to mean something. It will, Tina said. After Sade left the small room, Tina sat alone for a moment. She thought about 3 months. 3 months of a woman adjusting herself to fit an explanation for something that had never been her fault. She picked up her pen and began writing. Victor could not leave her alone. This was his nature, the inability to allow an affront to his authority to exist without a response. He had built his sense of himself around the principle that he was the most powerful person in any room he entered, and a pregnant consultant with a board appointment was a challenge to that principle that he could not tolerate in silence. During a department meeting 3 days into Tina's review, he arrived late, looked directly at her, and said to the room at large, "I see we are expanding our maternity support program. Will we be installing a nursery on the 4th floor, or is the executive suite preferred?" He smiled at his own comment. The room was silent. Tina looked up from her notes. She held his gaze for a moment, then she gave a small smile that contained something he could not read and returned to her notes. The smile bothered him more than any response would have. The following day, he sent a junior staff member to her temporary office with a large stack of filing that was entirely outside her terms of engagement. Tina accepted the files, thanked the junior staff member warmly, asked for the staff member's name and department, noted it in her book, and then set the files on a side table where they remained untouched. On the 6th day, at a meeting attended by regional managers and 2 external consultants, Victor said loudly and in Tina's direction, "We should probably schedule the consultant's deliverables around her delivery date. No pun intended." Several people at the table forced a response that was not quite a laugh. Tina looked at him. "I will be here," she said quietly, "for exactly as long as the board has engaged me to be here. My deliverables will be met on the agreed schedule." Then she returned to the presentation. Victor felt something he did not have a familiar name for. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was closer to the feeling you get when you reach for something you have always been able to reach and find that it is no longer where you left it. She was not breaking. He had been making people break for 11 years, and she was not breaking. And she was writing things in that notebook. The morning of the final meeting, Victor arrived at the office at 8:15 wearing his best agbada. He had been told there was a full company meeting. Senior leadership, regional managers, shareholders, board members. He had not been told the specific agenda because the specific agenda had been designed to be received rather than prepared for. He took a seat in the 3rd row of the main conference hall and greeted colleagues near him with the specific warmth he deployed in environments where senior management was visible. At the front of the room, behind the long table on the raised platform, several people were already seated. Tina was there, her notes arranged in front of her, her hand on her stomach. Beside her was Barrister Chioma Eze in a tailored dark suit. Chief Adewale Fashola sat at the center of the table. The managing director, Mr. Okoro, stood at the microphone, looking like a man who had spent the previous 24 hours making peace with something difficult. "Before we begin," Mr. Okoro said, "I would like to introduce a guest who has traveled from Abuja this morning." The door at the back of the hall opened. Senator Emeka Obiara walked in. He was not a man who entered rooms with theater. He walked the way he walked everywhere, at a steady pace, making eye contact with people as he passed them rather than looking toward the front of the room. 2 aides accompanied him, and he took his seat at the head of the table without ceremony. Victor did not know him personally, but he recognized him. Every person in that room recognized him, and recognition of a face like that in a room like this produces a specific quality of attention. The entire hall recalibrated. Victor felt his stomach tighten. He did not know yet why. Mr. Okoro began. "As the board is aware, a confidential review of our HR practices has been conducted over the past 2 weeks. Today, we are here to address the findings of that review." The projector came alive. The first slide was a graph showing the number of formal employee complaints over the past 5 years. The number should have been higher, the slide explained, based on the volume of informal reports collected during the review period. The gap between formal complaints and actual incidents suggested a culture in which employees did not believe that reporting would produce results. The second set of slides showed testimonies. Text from interviews, some with names, some anonymized at the employee's request. Story after story after story. The room was very quiet. Victor read his own name in 3 of them. His face changed. The third slide was different. Mr. Okoro said, "We have also reviewed the reception CCTV footage from the morning of the 15th. The screen filled with footage. It was the lobby. It was 9:22 in the morning. It was a pregnant woman standing in a queue with a folder held against her chest. It was Victor walking toward her. It was the folder leaving her hand without her offering it. It was the tearing once, twice, 3 times, and then the pieces falling to the floor and Victor's expression as they fell, and the other applicant looking away, and nobody in that lobby moving to her. It was Tina bending down and picking up 1 half-torn page and putting it in her bag and walking to the door." The hall was completely silent. Victor's hands were on his knees. He could feel that his hands were shaking and he was trying to keep them still, and the effort of keeping them still was taking everything he had. The senator leaned forward. "Mr. Adeyemi," his voice said. His voice was the voice of someone who has decided to be very precise with every word because precision is what the moment requires. "Do you recognize the woman in the footage?" Victor nodded. His throat had not produced words. "Please answer verbally." "Yes, sir," he said. "I recognize her." The senator looked at him for a moment. "That woman came to your building on that morning as a job applicant. She did not use my name. She did not mention my office or my position. She submitted her application the way any Nigerian job seeker submits an application, with her own credentials, her own recommendation letters, her own qualifications, and through her own years of study and work." He paused. "She came to your building as Tina, a Nigerian woman who wanted a fair chance." He paused again. "For years, this organization has maintained a system in which the person responsible for the culture and dignity of your recruitment process has been using that position to humiliate, dismiss, and diminish the people who came here hoping for a fair chance. Today, that system ends, not because of who Tina is, because it was always wrong. Because the people who sat in that lobby and said nothing were also casualties of a culture that made silence feel like the only safe option. Because every person who walked out of this building carrying what Tina carried to her car that morning deserved better and did not receive it." He looked at Mr. Okoro. "The board has agreed to address this matter fully and publicly." Mr. Okoro straightened. "Mr. Victor Adeyemi, the board of directors of Prestige Meridian Industries is formally terminating your employment effective immediately on grounds of gross misconduct. You will surrender your access credentials and all company property within the hour. You will also be reported to the relevant professional bodies." Victor stood up. His legs were uncertain beneath him. He began to speak. He said he had not known. He said if he had known. He said 12 years. He said please. The senator raised his hand. "The most painful part of this is not what you did. It is what you just said. You are sorry because of who she is. If she had been an ordinary Nigerian woman without a senator for a husband, you would have moved to the next person in that lobby and never thought about her again. That is the thing you need to sit with, Mr. Adeyemi. Not that you got caught, but that you would not have stopped." Victor had no answer for that. Then the door at the back of the hall opened. Ngozi walked in. She was wearing a simple blue dress. Her eyes were clear. Beside her was an older woman, Mama Adeyemi, who had traveled from Ibadan on the early morning bus and who walked with the specific heaviness of a woman who loves her son and has spent years watching him become someone she did not raise. They took seats in the front row. Victor saw them. His face did something that faces do when the last protection against reality is removed. It simply collapsed, not dramatically, completely. The architecture of composure that he had been deploying since the footage appeared on the screen was gone. What remained was a man who had run out of surfaces to hide behind. Ngozi spoke. Her voice was soft, her words were specific. She said that the man in the footage was the same man who came home to her and her children. She said that the loudness did not stay at the office. She said there were evenings when she sat with the bathroom door closed, because it was the only room in the flat where the atmosphere was reliably calm. She said she had stayed because leaving required resources she had not yet assembled, and because 3 children complicated every calculation. She said she was not angry. She said she was tired. She said she wanted her children to understand that the way their father treated people was not the only way available. She said one specific thing that the room received in complete silence. She said that her 12-year-old son had taught himself to read the sound of his father's key in the lock, so he would know in advance whether it was safe to be visible. She said a 12-year-old child should not need that skill. Mama Adeyemi did not speak for a long time after Ngozi finished. Then she said, "I raised this boy with everything I had. I taught him two things. How you treat people who cannot do anything for you is who you actually are. And every human being standing in front of you is carrying something you cannot see. Treat them accordingly." She stopped. Somewhere he forgot. I am praying he remembers, and I am grateful that he has been stopped before he forgot it completely. Victor's head was in his hands. He had no more arguments, he had no more strategies, he had no more surfaces. The senator stood for the final time. He said, "Let this be clearly understood, not just by this company, but by every organization in this country that is watching or will hear about today. The person standing in your lobby as a job applicant could be anyone's child, anyone's wife, anyone's mother. You do not need to know their family name to treat them with the dignity they arrived with. Respect is not a reward reserved for people you recognize. It is the basic right of every human being who stands in front of you." He looked at Ngozi. "I am sorry for what today has cost your family publicly. No action will be taken against you or your children. The shame of his choices belongs to him alone. And to his children, wherever they are today, your father's actions do not determine your future. You are not what he did. You can be better. You will be better." Ngozi nodded. Mama Adeyemi whispered something that sounded like a prayer of gratitude. Victor was escorted out. He walked through the corridors of Prestige Meridian Industries for the last time. He passed the office where he had worked for 11 years. He passed the lobby where he had torn the folder. He passed the reception desk where the receptionist did not look up as he went by. He walked through the glass doors. The afternoon sun was direct and specific on his face. He stood outside for a moment. He had nowhere particular to be. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that produce a different person if the person chooses to allow them to. Victor rented a room in a shared apartment in Yaba. It was small. It was nothing like the Lekki flat. The silence in it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of a house waiting to calibrate itself to his mood. The silence of a room that contained only him and therefore was entirely honest about what that amounted to. Ngozi, supported by Mama Adeyemi, told him clearly and without cruelty that she was not in a position to continue under the same roof. She was not ending the marriage in that moment. She was creating the distance that her children needed and that she herself needed. She gave him a clear condition: real help, a real counselor, real evidence of change over real time, not promises, not tears, not the specific performance of remorse that she had seen before and that had never produced anything that lasted. Real change, demonstrated over months, not a declaration of intention, but a record of behavior. He agreed, not because he had fully changed, because for the first time in many years, he understood that he was the only person left who could make himself change, and that nobody around him was going to do it for him. He enrolled in an anger management program with a counselor who had the specific quality of asking questions that made it impossible to hide behind answers. He got a small job, administrative work at a printing company. The salary was a fraction of what he had earned at Prestige Meridian. The title was nothing. His colleagues were younger than him, and some of them were less experienced, and none of them knew who he had been or what he had had. He was polite to all of them. Not performatively, not because he was building something, because he had discovered in the small room in Yaba that his mother's 2 instructions were still inside him somewhere. They had not been destroyed, they had been buried, under 11 years of choices that had felt like strength and had turned out to be the most expensive weakness he had ever sustained. He found them again, slowly, the way you find something in a room you have not entered in a long time, by standing still, by letting your eyes adjust, by not reaching for the light switch immediately, but giving the darkness a moment to become something your eyes could work with. He was not a reformed man. He was a man in the process of reformation. It was harder and slower and less dignified than anything he had ever done. It was also the most honest thing he had ever done. And the day he drove to his mother's house in Ibadan on a Saturday morning and sat in her kitchen and told her, without preparation and without managing the impression it made, what he had done and who he had become, and watched her face move through things that were not easy to watch, and did not look away, and did not defend himself, was the day that Mama Adeyemi looked at her son across the kitchen table and said quietly, "There he is. There is the boy I raised." He had not cried since the conference room. He cried then. 3 months after the conference room, Tina gave birth to a daughter. They named her Adana. She arrived at 2:44 in the morning and was placed in Tina's arms and lay there looking at the world with the specific expression of someone who has just arrived and is taking the first inventory of what they have gotten into. Tina looked at her for a long time. She thought about a lobby, about a folder, about a half-torn page on a parking lot passenger seat, about the people who had looked away and the people who had looked and not moved, about Sade's 3 months, about the 12-year-old boy who had taught himself to read a key in a lock, about a woman named Mama Adeyemi standing at her son's kitchen table saying, "There is the boy I raised." She thought about how much had changed in 3 months. She thought about how much was still to change. Then Adana moved in her arms, and the inventory was complete, and nothing needed to be done right now except this: holding her daughter in a room that smelled of new beginning, while outside, the Lagos morning was beginning to make itself available. The half-torn page was still in her bag. She had kept it deliberately. One day, she would show it to Adana. One day, when the girl was old enough to understand what it meant, she would say, "This is what someone tried to take from me. This is what I picked up off the floor and kept. This is the thing they did not manage to destroy." And then she would say the thing that mattered most. She would say, "You will encounter people in your life who believe their authority has the right to diminish you. They are wrong. Authority is a function. Dignity is a right. Do not allow anyone to confuse these two things, and do not allow anyone to confuse them for you. Put what they tear back in your bag. Carry it out the door, and never once let them see you doubt its value." If this story found something in you today, like this video right now before you scroll anywhere else. Share it with one person who has ever been dismissed before they were seen. Subscribe to this channel because more stories are coming and they will reach you when you need them. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see where this travels. And tell me what you think. Did Victor's story end the right way? Or did he deserve more consequences than he received? I want your honest answer. I read every comment. I see every country. I will see you in the next story. The end.